Okay, in this lesson, I want to take a look at the second half of the play Antigone and conclude with that work, and then move into some history and some philosophy thereafter. Let me just say a quick word about assessing Antigone and assessing literature in general in a humanities class. So, as I said, with Antigone, we're reading the majority of it in class, and so there's not a need for like reading check quizzes as we go through the most of the reading. I will usually allow the students to read the concluding section, right? So after Antigone is led off to be executed, and Tiresias makes his appearance. I'll have the students read that concluding section of the play, right, from Tiresias' appearance to the end, and then there will be a reading check quiz for them. But that's it, right? We're reading the rest of it together in class. At the end of the play, then you can give a kind of standard literary assessment type test, right, where you're just asking students kind of details, certain details about the play, certain kind of factual questions about what took place, just to make sure that they were locked in and absorbing the general plot line of the story, basic features about the character, with some kind of short answer thematic type questions of the sort, where you would ask students, let's say, to summarize Creon's opening speech, right, or summarize his attitude towards the polis, or his understanding of the polis, right, as revealed in that speech, right? Those kinds of questions. I like to. You could also ask a longer essay question where you're asking the students to kind of thematically to dwell on the thematic issues that are raised in the course of text. I actually like to save that essay for a little later on, because I think Antigone connects well to the apology, which I take a look at a little later on in the course with the students. And then I ask them to write an essay kind of comparing or connecting those two works, and I'll talk about that when I get there. But that's a way of assessing the students on their reading of Antigone as well. So those are some of the options that you have when you get to the end of a literary text, and you want to kind of assess the students' absorption of the material. As well as the kinds of short reading check quizzes that you would give students as you're working through the reading that you're not doing in class. Okay, so I left off in Antigone with the confrontation between Creon and Antigone, where Antigone famously articulates her understanding of the relationship between the natural law and the positive law, right? The higher law and the laws of the state. From there, Creon orders that she and her sister Ismene, who he suspects of being involved in the burial to death. And at this point, his son Hymen makes an appearance, and Hymen is engaged to Antigone, and he comes to plead for Antigone's life. And he's in obviously a difficult spot here, right? Insofar as that he is the son of the king and owes a kind of double obedience to Creon, both as subject and as son, right? But of course he's engaged to Antigone, and so has a love for her and is trying to preserve her life. But also just he sees the injustice of Creon's decree here and the way he's treating her, and wants to argue for her life on the grounds of simple, straightforward justice. So he approaches the discussion delicately, and I always am at pains to point this out to the students. He starts off by emphasizing to his father the rightfulness by which he rules. That he's not calling into question his right to rule, but he is admonishing him to rule well, right? And he points out that a number of people in the city have heard about what has taken place. They side with Antigone. They see that she did something noble and pious in burying her brother, despite the decree, despite knowing the consequences of the decree, and they think that she's acted heroically. And Haman wants Creon to be aware of that point of view and to understand it and to learn from it. Right? So he's not challenging Creon's authority, but what he's doing is admonishing Creon to use that authority well. And in fact, what Hymen is the real significance of what he's saying here is that he's showing Creon, but he's showing the audience really, the way to navigate what seemed to be this kind of intractable dilemma, right, between the claims of the state and the claims of the higher law, the natural law, right? Which we said that those are in some sense the problem here, the conflict between those two principles seem to be irreconcilable. Hyman is presenting a way of reconciling them, and it's in the character of the ruler. It's in the virtue of the ruler where those two things can be reconciled. Insofar as the ruler, insofar as Creon is dedicated, committed to ruling well, to ruling in a way that shows respect for the higher law, he can reconcile the law of the state to the higher law. He can reconcile the polis to the gods, right? And he can reconcile the demands of the polis to the demands of the gods. But it takes virtue on his part. It takes a willingness to recognize that he's been in error, that he's been intemperate. It takes a willingness to listen to his subjects. And Hyman is admonishing to do just that. So there's a real great significance to what Hyman is doing. He's the one who comes in and says, this is the way out of this dilemma. This is the way through this dilemma. And it all in here is in the virtue of the ruler. Creon doesn't want to hear it. He responds with great anger. He thinks Hyman has taken Antigone's side, and he threatens to have Antigone actually killed in front of him, at which point Hyman storms off, saying that Creon will never lay eyes on him again. Right? And we are led to foreshadow what those words might mean later on in the story. Again, at this point in the story, I will allow the students to read the conclusion on their own. And the significance of the conclusion really is that that Antigone's point of view and really Hyman's attempt to reconcile her point of view to the demands of the state are vindicated in the downfall of Creon. Right? When Tiresias comes out and tells Creon that the sacrifices are not working, that there's a kind of crime that the gods are angry with, and he's pointing to Creon's oppression of Antigone as that crime, it's clear at this point now that Sophocles wants us to understand now that Creon is in the wrong here, right? That though he stands for a valuable principle, an important principle, and one that's central to the Greek self-understanding, he's taken it too far. He's taken it beyond the limits. He's taken his commitment to that principle beyond the limits. He's not recognized. He's not been willing to recognize the limitations and the derivation of that principle. Right? How the laws of the state only take their value, only demand their obedience because of their adherence to a higher law. Right? So again, but the point is not that he's evil or he's a villain, but he's a man committed to a sound principle who takes that commitment too far. And refuses to recognize the other principles that he owes allegiance to as well, right? And this might be a place to refer to Aristotle's understanding of tragedy and the tragic hero and his character, right? Aristotle says that the real tragic hero is not a man who's entirely good or entirely bad, but a good man who has a kind of flaw, who makes a kind of error, right? The so-called hamartia, which is not to be understood as a sin, right? Not as a moral sin, but as some kind of error here, right? And Creon is arguably the tragic hero here, right? The play is called Antigone, and of course her death constitutes one of the culminations of the tragic action here. But it's really Creon who, at the end of the story, is presented as the ruined man, as the real tragic figure. And again, it's not because he's a bad man, but a commitment to a good principle, which he simply takes too far. And so that this is all, I think, vindicated then in the conclusion of the story, with Tiresias accusing Creon, and then Creon himself, as he rushes to the cave where he's had Antigone walled up alive to release her. As he goes there, he stops to bury the body of Polynices himself, which is a kind of a clear admission on his part that he was wrong and he went too far. And then when he gets to the cave, Antigone's already dead, and his son Hymen then commits suicide in front of him, and this is the real downfall for him. So by the end of the story, he's a ruined husk of a king, and we are led to understand that this is a consequence of his failure to understand the limitations upon the principle to which he has expressed such deep commitment. And so the Athenians themselves, I think Sophocles wants them to understand that, that their commitment to the polis, their, that patriotism that was expressed so memorably in Pericles' funeral oration has deeper and more superintending philosophical groundings, which, if not recognized, can lead to disaster. And of course, that insight will have all sorts of reverberations as the Peloponnesian War unwinds. Okay, speaking of the Peloponnesian War, this would be the time to return back to that conflict and take a look at some of the events in the middle that unfold in the middle of that conflict. And at this stage, we're relying heavily on Thucydides to provide us with insight into this conflict and the kind of patterns of human nature and human history that are revealed in the course of this conflict. Because that's what, again, Thucydides tells us very explicitly in the opening of the work, in his kind of preface to his history, that he sees in this conflict a kind of pattern for later times, right? He's very explicit about the fact that that in studying the Peloponnesian War, we can learn about certain dynamics of human history that are going to play themselves out repeatedly. And so he does a great job in the course of his history putting his finger on some of those patterns. And I've talked a little bit about that already. So we want to rely heavily on him at this point. So I think one of the passages we want to take a look at with those students is his account of the Mytilenean Revolt and the aftermath of the Mytilenean Revolt. It's in Book 3 where he gives a story. So Mytilene is one of the it's an outlying city-state in the Aegean, and they're a member of the Delian League. They decide around 428 that they want out of the league and don't want to be drawn further into the conflict that is unfolding. The Athenians put down the revolt, and then they debate, like, what should we do now with the Mytileneans in consequence of their revolt, right? And there's a strong contingent of Athenians in the assembly who want the men all put to death and the women and children sold into slavery, the city destroyed, in other words, and made a example to any other members of the league who might want to revolt. Votes on that course of action. They send a ship out to the Mytileneans to carry out, to execute this plan. But it's clear that a number of the Athenians have reservations. So they call for a meeting the next day and reopen the debate. And Thucydides records the debate as it unfolds, particularly between two figures, one of whom is Cleon, and he's kind of the populist demagogue figure here, and he's always kind of counseling the Greeks to the most reckless and violent course of action. And he gets up and he reproaches the Athenians for kind of rethinking this. He says it's clear that we have to go through with this punishment of the Mytileneans, and otherwise other sea states are going to do the same sort of thing. So it's a kind of a classic. A classic appeal to realpolitik, right? Never mind whether this is good or bad. Never mind, whether this is just or not. We just need to do this in order to keep our alliance intact, in order to prevail in this conflict. That's it, all right? We just have to do this to make an example of the Mytileneans. And what he says, he says something in the course of his speech, which is very, very notable, and I think you want to call attention to the students. And again, this is in Book 3, it's paragraph 37. He says, "What you do not realize," he says to the Athenians, "is that your empire is a tyranny exercised over subjects who do not like it and who are always plotting against you. You will not make them obey you by injuring your own interests in order to do them a favor. Your leadership depends on superior strength and not on any goodwill of theirs. Make them fear you, not love you." Right? Cleon is a Machiavelli, two millennia ahead of his times. Right? That's pure Machiavellian politics that he's invoking there. Right? Just make your enemies fear you. Don't worry about their goodwill. Okay? And he says specifically, blatantly, explicitly, he says, you have an empire, right? Again, notice he's using that word empire, which is, it should sound remarkable to the students, given that, the Athenians were the leading force fighting against the Persian Empire, right? Fighting against the idea of empire. And here they are, now the empire depending merely on their own strength, right? And he says, in fact, not only that they have an empire, but they're exercising a tyranny, right? Very explicit. Athens' role in the so-called Delian League, which is now nothing more than the Athenian Empire, is as hegemon, tyrant over its affiliated city-states. And it exercised that tyranny through mere power. Not through any claim to virtue, not through any claim to righteousness or justice or freedom. We're the head of this alliance, or this league, or this empire, which is what it is, because we're the most powerful, and that's it. And so come to terms with that, Cleon is saying, and never mind trying to to rule justly or to invoke justice here. Just maintain your authority through strength. Okay. A figure named Diodatus gets up and responds to Cleon, and this is a good speech, I think, to have the students paraphrase, because his argument's pretty subtle, and seeing whether the students can grasp the subtlety is a good exercise for them. Because I mean, the obvious response to make to Cleon is that we shouldn't. I mean, the obvious argument to make is we shouldn't kill the Mytileneans because killing them is wrong, right? Like, make wholesale massacre of the population of a city and enslavement of its women and children is just wrong, right? There's an obvious moral argument to make here. Diodatus doesn't make that argument, and seeing if the students catch that is, as I said, it's a valuable exercise on to test their ability to read closely. Diodatus actually says, no, it's the reason why we shouldn't kill them is because then other city-states that revolt, that we have to fight, are going to fight to the death, knowing that if we prevail, we're going to put them all to death. We're going to ruin their city. If we show mercy to the Mytileneans here, then other city-states with whom we may have to fight, other revolting poli, right, that we might have to fight, may be willing to surrender earlier in the conflict if they have the hope that we'll show them mercy too. And so we'll save the resources, we'll save the effort of having to fight future city-states to the death, right, if they're willing to surrender in the hopes of leniency. So it's Diodatus' response is every bit as informed by a kind of realpolitik as Cleon. He just doesn't draw the same kind of conclusions, right? He thinks that a concern for the power and preeminence of Athens demands that the Athenians show leniency here. So it's ultimately Diodatus' argument that prevails, and the Athenians do now vote to spare the Mytileneans. And Thucydides tells us the story. It's a great passage to read with them because the narrative is interesting here. They send out a ship that goes out the next day to bring the order to spare the Mytileneans, and so this ship now is rowing extra hard to get there in time to make sure that they deliver their message before the first message is carried out and all the Mytileneans are killed. And they row and sure enough they get there in time to prevent the massacre of the Mytileneans. So it's a kind of dramatic moment in Thucydides' narrative. Another passage I think you want to take a look at in Thucydides comes a little later on in Book 3, where he describes the revolution in Corcyra, the civil war in Corcyra. And he makes the point, Thucydides makes the point, that by this stage of the conflict, as he puts it, practically the whole of the Hellenic world was convulsed with rival parties in every state. Democratic leaders trying to bring in the Athenians and the oligarchs trying to bring in the Spartans, right? So the whole of the Greek world has been absorbed into this conflict, and every individual polis has kind of parties or partisan groups that are affiliated or allied with one side or the other, right? Or sympathetic to one side or the other. And so this causes violence in all these city-states as a result of this larger conflict, right? So the violence between, or the enmity between Sparta and Athens then spills into the entirety of the Greek world. So he describes some of the events that happen here, and he describes the violence of the fighting in Corcyra, and then he draws kind of the larger the larger picture of how this is happening all over the Greek world and how it's happening, and what are the kind of moral and spiritual dynamics that are at work here. And I think this is the passage that you want to read through with the students. Again, it's in book 3, or in like paragraph 82 or so. And I'll just read a bit, right? He says, revolutions broke out in city after city, and in places where the revolutions occurred late, the knowledge of what had happened previously in other places caused still new extravagances of revolutionary zeal, expressed by an elaboration in the methods of seizing power and by unheard of atrocities in revenge. To fit in with the change of events, words too had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man, and to plot against an enemy behind his back was perfectly legitimate self-defense. Anyone who held violent opinions could always be trusted, and anyone who objected to them became a suspect. So it's a really insightful passage in the way that Thucydides really kind of puts his finger on what happens to populations and their kind of collective mindsets in the course of military conflict, right, under the stress and influence of war. And how there's a kind of dynamic that pushes them further and further towards extremes and causes them to dismiss attempts at moderation, attempts at prudence, and to be ever pushing and ever preferring more extreme courses of action, more violent courses of action. And so the war and the violence of war becomes a kind of, it starts to feed upon itself. And again, this is part of what Thucydides wants us to understand is kind of a basic fact of human life and human nature, right? That under the stresses of military, this is how populations are always going to act, right? And this is why wars become so violent and destructive and all-consuming, because there's a certain kind of dynamic at play that compels men to pursue greater and greater extremities of violence. And given the right circumstances, given the right exposure to the stresses of war, human beings are always going to act this way. So it's a really important and insightful passage, and I like to read it through with the students and emphasize just these points, right? That here Thucydides is trying to is more than trying. He is unfolding for us, disclosing for us the ineradicable patterns of human history. There's a number of other battles and events that unfold at this course of the conflict that are worth taking a look at if you have the time to do so. The Battle of Sphacteria, I think, is a battle well worth taking a look at because it's the first time that Spartan soldiers are defeated in the field, and it is, as Thucydides tells us, it was a moment that caused astonishment throughout Greece. Right, the Spartans were hitherto thought to be invincible, and due to a number of kind of strange turns of fate and contingencies, they are a army of Spartiates is defeated and forced to surrender in the field. Thucydides tells the story of the events around Pylos and Sphacteria and the fighting that goes on there. It's worth taking a look at his account of the debate in the Athenian assembly that occurs in the midst of that fighting. It's in book 4, roughly chapters 27 and 28, because it's one of the more comic episodes, right? Because there's Cleon is back to his old ways, kind of demanding that the Spartans be wiped out. And he says, if I were there, I would have prevailed already. And his political opponent, Nicias, proposes that he be sent out as the leader of this expedition. And Cleon actually demurs at this. And no, I'm not. I wouldn't go that far. And the Athenian assembly actually compel him. They vote him the leader of this expedition, basically saying, like, put your money where your mouth is. And Cleon says, fine, I'll go. And sure enough, he winds up winning, and he winds up with this great victory, and much to the astonishment of the Athenians. But this is kind of almost comic episode that unfolds that Thucydides tells about. So that's worth taking a look at. There's the Battle of Delium, which is one of the rare occasions in which the Athenians do meet the Spartans. The Spartan alliance in the field is actually primarily Thebans, I believe, who they're fighting against there, and they are defeated. And it kind of is it is some justification or vindication of Pericles' strategy of avoiding these kinds of set battles with the other side, because they are defeated, and it's a defeat that does cost them. What's notable, one of the things that's notable about the Battle of Delium is this is where Socrates will fight and display particular heroism on the battlefield, saving his good friend Alcibiades in the midst of the rout. The Battle of Amphipolis in the north of Greece unfolds a couple years later, and this is the battle at which Cleon is killed, leading the Athenian forces against the city. At the same time, the leader of the Spartan defense, Brasidas, one of the most talented generals among the Spartans, is killed as well. And this is the point at which both sides have become more or less exhausted with the conflict, and there's sizable numbers on both sides seeking out some kind of end to the fighting at this stage. So in 421, the Peace of Nicias is established, which is effectively a truce between the two sides. Nicias is the Athenian leader who is an advocate for peace, and because of that advocacy, the peace takes its name from him. And this is intended to bring an end to the fighting, but as we'll see, only provides a kind of interlude for the fighting, for both sides to kind of lick their wounds and prepare to carry on. Okay, and this would be the place to return back to Thucydides and take a look at the famous Melian dialogue, which he recounts in Book 5, beginning around paragraph 84. And this is a justly famous passage from the work. It's probably, with Pericles' funeral oration, one of the two most famous passages from the work. And you're going to want to set some time aside to read through this and read it carefully with the students. I read through the whole thing with the students in class. And it'll take a couple periods to do so, and then you can kind of follow it up with a kind of paraphrase or summary assignments where you're asking the students to kind of summarize the argument of the Athenians. So basically, the background to this story is that the island of Milos was an island that had stayed neutral throughout the conflict up to this point. The Athenians want them to join their side, to join the Delian League. The Melians refuse. The Athenians send out a military force to subject them, and before kind of launching their force upon the Melians, they make one last appeal to them to surrender, right, not to fight. And the dialogue that Thucydides recounts here is then a kind of debate or discussion or argument that ensues between the Athenian generals, the leaders of the Athenian military expedition, and the leaders of Milos. And in that dialogue, the Athenians are trying to persuade the Melians to surrender. The way they do so, though, the arguments that they use are extremely revealing. And again, I think this is what makes this dialogue so memorable, is that it reveals the Athenian character and their approach to this whole conflict in a way that's stunning, and which Thucydides clearly sees as kind of wrapped up in their eventual downfall here, right? So the Athenians tell the Melians, who are appealing for mercy, the Athenians say, We on our side will use no fine phrases saying, for example, that we have a right to our empire because we defeated the Persians, or that we have come against you now because of the injuries you have done us. A great mass of words that nobody would believe. And we ask you on your side not to imagine that you will have influence with us by saying that you, though a colony of Sparta, have not joined Sparta in the war, or that you have never done us any harm. In other words, never mind any moral arguments, right? We're not going to make those arguments to you. Don't make them to us, right? This conversation that we're going to have is not going to be about who's right and who's wrong, or about who's committing an act of justice or injustice. Never mind any of that, the Athenians say, right? So right from the beginning, the Athenians framed the discussion in these completely amoral terms, right? What we would now refer to as like Machiavellian or realpolitik, right? Terms of political reasoning. Put morality outside the question, the Athenians tell the Melians. Instead, we recommend that you should try to get what is possible for you to get, taking into consideration what we both really do think. Since you know as well as we do that when these matters are discussed by practical people, the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel, and that in fact the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Right? The famous line, right? The strong do what they will, the weak what they must. We're stronger, you're weaker. We'll impose our will on you, and you should simply submit. That's it. Right? Never mind, like, do we have the right to do this? Or are we in the right to? Never mind. Just we're stronger, you're not. So surrender. Right? And they're telling the Melians, so don't enter into this discussion or this debate on moral terms, because those are not the terms of the conundrum in front of you. Deal with this as practical people and simply recognize the very practical fact that you're weaker and should surrender on those terms. Right? So it's an extraordinary passage here. And it shows what's happened to the Athenians as a result of their enjoyment of power, the rise to empire. Right? There's no language here anymore about fighting for freedom or fighting for the Hellenes. It's just we're stronger, and so we'll do what we can do with our strength. Right? The Melians respond by effectively ignoring that or not getting the point, because they say, in the case of all who fall into danger, there should be such a thing as fair play and just dealing. Such people should be allowed to use and to profit by arguments that fall short of mathematical accuracy. Right? They say your own fall would be visited by the most terrible vengeance. It would be an example to the world. Right? So there should be a sense of fair play that operates here, and that should determine your course of action. Right? We are going to make the appeal to justice, because you are men and you have a sense of justice, and you can't entirely ignore that. Right? So you can't pretend yourselves to be acting from completely amoral motives, because men never act from entirely amoral motives. Well, the Athenians really don't want to hear any of that. They dismiss the warning about what may happen to them as a consequence of their downfall. They say you can leave it to us to face the risks involved. And then when the Melians say, would you not agree to being neutral, friends instead of enemies? The Athenians say no, because it's not so much your hostility that injures us. It's rather the case that if we were on friendly terms with you, our subjects would regard that as a sign of weakness in us, whereas your hatred is evidence of our power. Right? Again, all we're trying to do here is maintain our power and our supremacy. We don't care whether we're acting justly or not. Right? We have the strength to do this, so we're going to do this. Right? And if you hate us, that only magnifies our power. Again, this is all going to reverberate several years later when the students get to Machiavelli. Right? If in your curriculum, if that's the way it's designed, I'm assuming most students do encounter the prince at some point in their high school studies, and Machiavelli will be very clear about this. Right? The prince doesn't worry about whether he's loved or not. He's just worried about whether he's feared. Right? the argument's more subtle than that, but clearly there's reverberations here later on. Well, the Melians try a couple different other tacks, right? They're kind of stuck in or locked into this kind of moral way of looking at this, and say, well, won't we show ourselves great cowards and weaklings if we fail to face everything that comes rather than submit to slavery, right? That's a good Greek way of looking at this situation that they're in, right? It's the way the Greeks who fought against the Persians would have looked at. It's the way the Athenians themselves, right, who fought at Marathon, so would have looked at a situation like this. This is the very ideals that they themselves espouse in the fight against the much greater empire of the Persians. And the Athenians say, no. They say, this is no fair fight with honor on one side and shame on the other. It's rather a question of saving your lives and not resisting those who are far too strong for you. Never mind all that stuff about honor. Never mind all that stuff about fight. Forget, you have no chance, and you should surrender because you have no chance. Put all those moral ideals aside. All right? The Melians make an appeal to the gods. Right? We trust that the gods will give us fortune as good as yours because we're standing for what's right against what's wrong. Right? And again, notice like they're still locked into this moral framework for understanding the situation, and they're not getting, or they don't want to get, or at least they're trying to prevail upon the Athenians who are looking at the situation from an entirely immoral point of view, right? And are demanding that the Melians do likewise. So the response to that is, our opinion of the gods and our knowledge of men lead us to conclude that it is a general and necessary law of nature to rule whatever one can. This is not a law that we made ourselves, nor were we the first to act upon it when it was made. We found it already in existence, and we shall leave it to exist forever among those who come after us. We are merely acting in accordance with it, and we know that you or anybody else with the same power as ours would be acting in precisely the same way, right? So you want to talk about the gods, the Athenians say, well, the gods are the ones who made the world this way, right? Who made men this way, right? In such a way that the strong prevail over the weaker. That's they created the order of things in which the strong prevail over the weaker. So we're just acting in accordance with that order. And we're not the first to do this, and we're not the last to do it. And you would do the same if you were in our shoes, right? So again, it's a appeal to the way of the world in the face of any appeal to kind of transcendent moral principles. Principles of justice, principles of honor, right? Principles of mercy. The Athenians are saying have no applicability here. The way of the world is that the strong do what they can, the weak what they must. We're strong, you're weak. Do what you have to do and surrender. The Melians refuse. The Melians are convinced that it would be dishonorable to surrender, and they do feel that they have right on their side. They also do have some hope that the Spartans will eventually show up and help them, which does not happen. So the Athenians, the Melians say they will not surrender. The Athenians attack, and the sad coda to the story then is they do in fact wipe out the entire city, killing off the men and sending the women and children into slavery. So exactly as the Athenians warned the Melians, that's exactly what comes to pass. And so the Melians make this heroic stand against the Athenians, but it leads to tragedy in the end. So, but what's revealed in the meantime is this extraordinary moral crudity that's set in among the Athenians, where the Melians are effectively making the kinds of arguments to them, or making the appeals to ideals that the Athenians themselves espouse in the course of their conflict with the Persians, right? A kind of commitment to fight against overweening power to the last, no matter what the sacrifice might be. Those were the sentiments filling the hearts of every Athenian who marched off to fight the Persians at Marathon. And here are the Athenians themselves a generation later saying, psh, forget those ideals. They're nonsense. All that matters is strength, and we're the stronger ones, right? So so there's again a kind of classical statement of political realism, right, or realpolitik that is being articulated here. But I think it's fair to say that in the place where it occurs here in the narrative, and in light of the larger history of the Athenians, that Thucydides presents this approach to politics as evidence of a kind of moral crudity that's set in here among the Athenians. And I think it's valuable for students to appreciate as such. Okay, it's around this point now where I will begin introducing students to the thought of Plato and Socrates. All right, so again, to reiterate the point I made earlier when I was talking about the pre-Socratics and introducing philosophical instruction to students in this coursework, I think at this stage the goal really is to try to help them kind of dip their toes into the waters of philosophical reflection and kind of get a sense of the dimensions of the primary questions that philosophers are wrestling with, and kind of hold off until later on in their careers to make a really deep dive into some heavy duty philosophical texts and let them wrestle with the arguments there. I think again at this point it's a little bit more valuable. I think it's more valuable for them to just have an understanding of the questions that are at stake in philosophical reflection. So you can at this stage take a look at a dialogue, a full-length dialogue with students if you choose the right one. I think there are a couple of dialogues that can work early on with students. Certainly, later on in their coursework, you're going to want students to take a look at the Republic, at least significant portions of the Republic. You might want them to take a look at a work like the Gorgias or one of those dialogues, maybe passages even from the Timaeus, which I think are highly interesting to students. But for an intro into Socrates, a dialogue like the Meno, or the Laches, which is a kind of meditation on courage. The first Alcibiades is a kind of relatively unknown dialogue, which was used at times in ages past as an introduction to Plato. I've never taught any of those dialogues in class. I do know of other teachers, other classical educators who have used those texts early on as a kind of stepping off point into Plato. So perhaps you want to take an adventure with one of those texts. What I do with students at this point is provide them some excerpts from different dialogues and allow those excerpts to provide a kind of introduction to Plato's thought. And then the one that we'll take a look at, the whole as a whole, is the Apology, which is the trial of Socrates. I think that's a text that freshman level students can wrestle with quite effectively. But my intro into to Plato will be by way of a number of excerpts, and these are usually some of the allegorical passages that Plato incorporates in his work to illustrate his arguments. So the obvious place to start, I think, is the cave, right? The allegory of the cave in the Republic, and there's so much out there. There's so much material out there on the cave, and there's so many resources that you can resort to. I don't want to say too much about that passage, but I think it's a good one to read with the students. It's really only like a page or two, and you can read it together with the students. You can kind of illustrate it with the students to give them a kind of visual depiction of the allegory that Plato's presenting there. And I think that the key point to make there, as you're using that as an intro into philosophical reflection, is that in some way philosophy is a kind of call to free oneself from illusion. Right? That our minds have this kind of inherent bent towards illusion. And most of us live our lives under the influence to some extent or another of illusion. And so what the philosophical life is a call to free oneself from illusion. Of course, this works very well with high school freshmen as they're beginning their upper academic work, right? As a theme for them to understand everything that they're going to be studying and doing over the course of their high school career. It's a kind of liberation from illusion, and a movement towards a true and enlightened way of seeing things. And then the other thing for them to get about that call is that it's hard, right? It's hard to answer that call, right? The attempt to liberate oneself from illusion is an exceedingly laborious effort, and not many people undertake it successfully. And those who do will not necessarily be welcomed by their peers, right? There's a sense of isolation that results from that pursuit. So I think these are all valuable things for students at this stage of their academic career to appreciate about what the pursuit of truth looks like, and the way that philosophy is a call to that pursuit at any cost. Another passage I like to take a look at with students is from the Phaedrus, another of the dialogues, and it's the chariot allegory. And this is also a famous passage. It's not quite as famous as the cave, but it's famous. And again, it kind of captures or provides a kind of synopsis of some key Socratic themes, right? And the passage provides a kind of allegory of the soul, and I'll just read this opening section here, and then you can take a look at the remaining portion in the notes to the lesson here. But Socrates declares that of the nature of the soul, though her true form be ever a theme of large and more than mortal discourse, let me speak briefly and in a figure, and let the figure be composite, a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. Now the winged horses and the charioteers of the gods are all of them noble and of noble descent, but those of other races are mixed. The noble charioteer drives his in a pair, and one of them is noble and of noble breed, and the other is ignoble and of ignoble breed, and the driving of them of necessity gives a great deal of trouble to him. I will endeavor to explain to you in what way the mortal differs from immortal creatures. The soul in her totality has a care of inanimate being everywhere and traverses the whole heaven in diverse forms appearing. When perfect and fully winged, she soars upward and orders the whole world, whereas the imperfect soul, losing her wings and drooping in her flight, at last settles on the solid ground. There, finding a home, she receives an earthly frame, which appears to be self-moved, but is really moved by her power. And this composition of soul and body is called a living and mortal creature. So, the image then is of a chariot led by two horses, and the interpretation of this image then varies, and you can kind of acquaint the students with the different variations. But the basic idea is that the chariot or charioteer is the soul or the mind or reason, and it's compelled to navigate by way of these two horses, one of noble breed, one of ignoble breed. Again, the horse of noble breed is sometimes associated with a desire, a thumos, right, of assertiveness. It's the spirited part of the human person that's aspiring upwards, right, in some way. Whereas the other, the ignoble. The ignoble steed is appetite, or the body itself, in which the appetite's in here, right? Which is gravitating towards the earth, right? Is pulling towards the earth. And so the goal of the charioteer is to keep these two horses in check in some way, right? Running in harmony, so that the charioteer can ride through the heavens, right? And again, the interpretation here it can be mixed, right? And it seems that Socrates believes that we are kind of led inherently, due to our corporal existence and the appetites and here in that corporal existence towards the earth, right? So that all of our chariots are eventually kind of drawn there eventually. He contrasts the mortal with the immortal chariots, which drive through the heavens endlessly, looking upon the heavens endlessly, right? Whereas, the mortal chariot is drawn downward or earthward, right? But the proper charioteer can guide his chariot by kind of yoking the appetitive horse and allowing the spirited horse to lead, can lead his chariot above the clouds and at least at times take a glimpse of the heavens. And that's the charioteer, the philosopher, right? So that in some way, right, what philosophy and the life of philosophy calls us to is an ascent, right? Is a glimpse or a glance at the heavenly things, which we only obtain by subduing our appetites or merely earthly desires and submitting them to this spirited orientation that leads us above the clouds to look on the transcendent and permanent things. That's the life that Socrates thinks philosophy calls us to. And that, I think, is a great call to place in front of students again at the early stages of their higher academic studies.